church's 300th anniversary in 2025, the Adult Education Board is sponsoring a series of speakers about the history of Connecticut, thereby helping us understand how the past has affected the present. We are very pleased to have Dr. Matthew Warshauer as our speaker tonight. Dr. Warshauer is the former chair of the Connecticut Civil War Commemoration Commission and a professor of history at Central Connecticut State University, where he received his bachelor's degree in American Studies. He has long been interested in what he calls, quote, the American paradox, end quote. That is, the discrepancy between the nation's founding document and the lack of freedom for such underrepresented and marginalized populations as slaves, indigenous people, and women. Because of his interest in this topic, he pursued an MA and a PhD at St. Louis University. As the author of 5 books and many articles and reviews, he has written extensively about Andrew Jackson, slavery, and the Civil War, and most recently about 9/11 and how this event has impacted the world in which we live. As you can see up there, Dr. Warshauer's topic tonight is Enslavement, Connecticut, and the Georgia of the North. Please welcome Dr. Matthew Warshauer.
Thank you for coming out. Appreciate it. And thank you for inviting me to this beautiful place. I was saying I drove up and then, out here in the darkness, right? And I came around a corner and I went, behold, the church was there, right? So this topic, obviously, the title is Enslavement, Connecticut, and the Georgia of the North. And you're going to find out what the Georgia of the North means in a moment. And this is an aspect of Connecticut history that I imagine a good portion of you don't necessarily know very well. And we're going to find out why we don't know this history. So this is William Lloyd Garrison. Garrison was, without question, the most well-known and most hated abolitionist in the United States. Certainly hated in the South. I joke with my students all the time that William Lloyd Garrison never contemplated a long vacation in Georgia, right? But Garrison was based out of Boston, which is where the majority of the abolition movement came from in the United States. And why Boston? Why did the abolitionists come from Boston? Because Garrison was there. And they went to meet with him and to learn from him and to learn how to develop abolitionism in the United States, primarily in the 1830s, 1840s, and 1850s. But he also had connections to Connecticut. His wife was from Brooklyn, Connecticut, which is where Garrison got married. So he knew what Connecticut was like, and this is what he had to say about it in 1833. Connecticut has been let alone too long by us meddlesome and pestiferous abolitionists, and I am rejoiced to learn that you have resolved to commence operations in this Georgia of the North, not having the fear of Canterbury before your eyes. So the question becomes, what does this mean? Don't worry, I'm going to tell you, right? So such a statement by the nation's most prominent and hated abolitionist raises key question about Connecticut's racial history, its commitment to abolition, and to the war itself. Equally important, why don't we know this history today? Why did Garrison make this statement about Connecticut? What was he referring to when he said the fear of Canterbury before your eyes? Right? And what did he mean by, I'm glad you're going to get started there? And the other part of this quote that I didn't add was he said, you might want to start in the rural areas. Don't go to the urban parts of the state because you're going to have problems there. And why did he say all that? Because he understood what this state was like and what the anti-abolitionist sentiment in the state of Connecticut was like. So let's begin. Why don't we know this is the main question that is before us. So why don't we know this history of Connecticut? Why are we suddenly arguing about Confederate monuments so much within our society today? And where are we in terms of the evolution of our society as it relates to issues of anti-black racism, of the continuing effort of the abolition movement, which the most basic element of abolition is civil and social rights and political rights for African Americans. How does that differ from emancipation? That's something that we need to think about as well, because they're not exactly the same. And so this is one of the pieces of the puzzle as to why we don't know these things today, because it's how the story of the Civil War was told for such a tremendously long period of time. This is a pamphlet that was put out by the Connecticut Civil War Commemoration Commission, the Centennial Commission. So it's put out in 1961. There is, at the Connecticut State Library, there is probably about 3 cubic feet of materials from this Centennial Commission that I went and I looked through every single document with a bunch of my graduate students, and we were picking it apart, trying to find clues as to what was the focus of the Centennial Commission. What did they, not just publicly, but what were they saying behind the scenes in letters to one another? And importantly for the commission that I ran, which was the Sesquicentennial Commission, which took me a while to figure out how to say, and I'm still not particularly good at spelling it, right? So our goal at the 150th anniversary of the Civil War, we kept asking ourselves, what will the Bicentennial Commission in 50 years say about what we did during our 150th commemoration? What was our goal in putting forth this commemoration? And one of my big goals for the commemoration, one of my big goals for my book, Connecticut and the American Civil War, was to tell this history that wasn't told correctly. Or, I don't know if correctly is the right way. It was avoided, let's put it that way. We'll talk about that. So this says, the chief purpose of the centennial is to strengthen the unity of the country through mutual understanding, an understanding derived from the realization that there was dedication and devotion on both sides. North and South, there were those who gave all they had in support of what they sincerely believed. The way that contemporary Americans would read the last part of this statement today about what they both believed is very different than the way they considered it or read about it 50 years ago. Okay? And so this is all about 100 years after the war, still focusing on what historians discuss as reconciliation between the North and the South. 100 years later, they're still working on this. So this gentleman is James Robertson, a very, very well-known Civil War historian. He was the executive director of the National Civil War Centennial Commission. He writes to Connecticut's commissioner of the Centennial. So these are 2 chairmen, one of the National Centennial Commission, one of the Connecticut State Centennial Commission. He writes to this gentleman named Albert Putnam in 1962, and he says, "Only those of us actively engaged in commemorating impartially a war that drives wedges of dissension and defiance among our grandfathers can understand the ominous, awesome task we have." So again, the focus is reconciliation. They're 2 generations out from the Civil War and writing to each other and commiserating that no one will really understand what it is we're trying to do here. Excuse me. He says further in here, he says further in this letter, he goes, "Now is not the time to discuss what caused the war. Let's leave that alone." Okay? And again, understand, when we think about contemporary America today, especially what's happened over the last number of years with the rise of BLM, and one of the questions we could ask ourselves is BLM an extension of the civil rights movement? Is the civil rights movement an extension of the abolition movement? Is it a continuous movement that's gone over time, that's ebbed and flowed, or are there distinct phases to it, right? And maybe the answer to those things are yes, it is a continuous movement, but it does have distinct phases, right? There's all kinds of things that we can look at here. But the fact that they don't want to get into what caused the war, only to focus on reconciliation, is very significant, again, in answering the main question that I asked of you, which is, why don't we know this history today? Okay? So then we can also consider the last book written on Connecticut and the Civil War, which was by a historian, a very well-known historian named John Niven, Connecticut for the Union. Right? The role of the state in the Civil War. That's the title of the book. So think about, just consider the title of the book, Connecticut for the Union, that all of Connecticut was for the Union. Was there dissension in Connecticut over this war? Does anybody know? Tremendous dissension. The Copperheads was one of the first images I had on this slide. Connecticut was almost 50-50 in the state as to whether or not we were going to engage this war. And this is a different talk, but the gubernatorial elections of 1860 and 1863 are absolutely fascinating, and had they turned out differently than the way that they did, in which William Alfred Buckingham became our governor, and he had to be elected every single year, right? Imagine the horror. Well, contemporary politics, right? So every year, he's one of the few Republican governors in the country that served all 4 years of the American Civil War. Had he not been elected in 1860, and more specifically in 1863, it is questionable how much support Connecticut would have given the Union in fighting this war. And make no mistake about it, Connecticut was integral to fighting this war. We created a third of all the Union weaponry, tremendous amounts of artillery, all of the supplies from the Naugatuck and Waterbury brass and copper industry, the rubber tents, all the textiles. I mean, we were the workhorse. This is why Connecticut is so far ahead in the Industrial Revolution of the post-Civil War period, because the Civil War is what launches us into all of it, right? So this is an incredibly important state. So the title, the idea that Connecticut is all for the Union, he hardly discusses dissent. More importantly, the 1965 publication date. This was a huge mistake on John Niven's part. He published it at the end of the Commemoration. That's never a good idea for book sales. My book, Connecticut and the American Civil War, came out in 2011 at the beginning of the Commemoration. So I'm definitely a better businessman than he is, right? So, but then, most importantly, the index. There's no listing in the index for slave, for slavery. The Connecticut 29th Black Regiment doesn't appear. So again, I joke about the publication date, but what's going on in the United States in 1965, except for my birth, which I know is important to all of you? Civil rights. So think about this. The centennial of the American Civil War is occurring in the midst of the civil rights struggle in the United States, when New Jersey sends down some of its delegates to, of all places, Charleston, South Carolina, to go to the National Centennial Commission meeting. Well, a couple of those members from New Jersey happen to be black, and they're not allowed into the commission hotel, right? So this is what's going on when this book is written. John Niven was probably in his 40s or 50s when he wrote this book. This is incredibly important too. He was raised in a pre-civil rights America, right? I was born in 1965. I was raised in a post-civil rights America. There's no way that I can write a book about Connecticut and the Civil War and not have the issue of enslavement and abolition central to the story of Connecticut. There's just no way. And so this tells us not just something about why do we know something or why don't we know something, but it tells you something about the way that the background and the sociocultural environment in which an historian is raised influences what they write and how they write about it. Right? Incredibly, incredibly important. So this, as I said, this is a post-civil rights book. I said, you consider the title, Connecticut in the American Civil War, slavery, sacrifice, and survival. Right? So it's about slavery. It's about sacrifice that many, many people make on behalf of this war effort. And then it's about survival in the aftermath of the war, because Connecticut is home to over 150 Civil War monuments, more than any other kind of war monument in the nation's history. The fact that we have over 150 Civil War monuments, they are dotted everywhere. You probably drive by one or two on a regular basis and don't even notice that it's there. Those monuments are up because the trauma that comes from this war, you couldn't have come. One thing that Niven really gets right is when you come to Connecticut at any time during that 4 years of the war, Connecticut looks like an armed camp. There are soldiers that are constantly coming, soldiers that are constantly going. Trains and boats are arriving with wounded soldiers, with dead soldiers. There are funerals happening all the time. You can't open the Hartford Courant or the Hartford Times or other local newspapers without seeing lists of casualties. I mean, this state is heavily, like the nation, heavily impacted. 750,000 Americans died during the American Civil War. Right? So when you look at the 2011 publication date, right, the index, slavery, Connecticut 29th Black Regiment, extensive information on abolition and anti-abolition. But what else is inside this book that's not inside Niven's? Right? History of slavery, history of anti-black racism, and in fact, when I was researching for this book, I found more information from newspapers and other publications on anti-abolition movements in Connecticut than I did on abolition movements. And this is why William Lloyd Garrison wrote what he did, because he understood what the culture of anti-black racism was like in the state of Connecticut. And so, I found numerous examples of a church like this, in which a pastor gets up and delivers an abolition speech and gets removed by his congregation because they don't like what he has to say. Or they rent out the church or another meeting house or a local place in town to an abolition movement, and the newspaper reports that a group of anti-abolitionists came and kicked the door in and broke up the meeting. Right? So these are the kinds of things that are happening throughout Connecticut in the 1830s and 1840s. So it's about abolition versus emancipation, which I'll talk about. It's about the racial battle that goes on in Connecticut even after the war is over, which is tremendously important for us to understand. So let's talk a little bit about slavery in Connecticut. This is a census report from 1782. And you can see here, it lists, whoops, I'm apparently having clicker issues tonight. Sorry. It lists the various counties in the state, the number of towns, males above 50, males above 16 and under 50, males under 16, females, the total number of whites, and in the final column, Indians and Negroes. Okay? What this ultimately ends up meaning, that at the time of about the American Revolution, Connecticut is home to a little over 5,000 enslaved people. Right? Mainly people of African descent. There are some natives among them, but mainly people of African descent. This makes Connecticut the single largest enslaved population in all of New England. Okay? That tells us a little bit about this background. Right? So 1776, the state held just over 5,000 humans in bondage, more than any other New England state. 1 in 4 estate inventories at the time included slaves. In 1784, the Connecticut General Assembly approved a gradual emancipation plan freeing slaves born after the act when they reached the age of 25. Right? Gradual emancipation was used in Connecticut, it was used in New York, it was used in a number of other northern states, and it was a way of slowly getting rid of slavery over a period of time. And they wanted to do it over a period of time for 2 reasons. One was so it would have the least potential economic impact on the slave owners, right? Because you're not doing it in one fell swoop, right? It's only after the person reaches the age of 25. That could spread out over a generation, and anyone born before the act remains a slave in perpetuity. Connecticut does not fully get rid of the institution of slavery until 1848, believe it or not. I mean, that's remarkable. So the second reason that they did it gradually is because, again, they don't want it done in one fell swoop. What might happen if 5,000 enslaved people were suddenly let go in society, in Connecticut society? What sort of horrible detrimental impact would that have on the fine people of Connecticut? So that's one of the rationales of this. And gradual emancipation is very, very important, the history of it, because Lincoln was very in favor of gradual emancipation all the way up to the summer of 1862. He tried to convince the border states to accept federally compensated gradual emancipation to get rid of the institution of slavery. It's only after the border states say, no, we won't do it, that Lincoln goes, well, all right, now I have to embrace emancipation, right? So by 1800, Connecticut's slave population had dropped to 939, and the number of free blacks had risen to 5,300. So one of the big questions that historians have been asking, Connecticut and New England historians, is, well, why does Connecticut suddenly decide after they pass gradual emancipation? Why do they just decide, oh, well, we're just going to push this through and get rid of enslavement completely? By the time 1848 comes around, there's only 17 very elderly enslaved people left in the state. So Connecticut really does get rid of it. So is there some sort of moral awakening that occurs in Connecticut? Is it the spirit of the American Revolution and the idea of equality and the rights of man and the Declaration of Independence that influences the people of Connecticut? No. It's that they realize that enslavement is not a good economic game for them, right? And there's lots of sources that I could show you that say, you know, if we could grow rice on the Connecticut River, we'd still have slavery. If our lands were good for cotton production, we'd still have slavery, right? So it's primarily an economic rationale that Connecticut goes, this isn't for us. And one of the things we got to be very clear about, the Puritans, the Congregationalists who founded Connecticut all the way up to the 1818 establishment, right? They were very, very shrewd businessmen and business people, right? And they knew what was economically feasible and what was not. I have a but in there. But, so we reduce the population, the free population rises to 5,300, and you might think, oh, that's great for those people who have been freed. It's not necessarily so great. This is the Constitution of 1818. You had started us off this evening by talking about Congregationalism and the concept of establishment. When Connecticut becomes a state, it does not write a new constitution. It continues to operate under its royal charter. They say, we don't have any reason for a new constitution. We'll just keep operating the way that we've been operating. That demanded that state taxes pay for the Congregational church. So Congregationalism was literally, as we call it, the established church of the state of Connecticut. Well, by the time you get to 1818, politics in the nation has changed. The Federalist Party, which was very much, this is the party of John Adams, the party of Alexander Hamilton, the Federalist Party has waned in political power significantly, especially in the aftermath of the War of 1812. Jefferson and Madison's Republican Party has risen up, and it's taken a while, but they've even made inroads into the state of Connecticut. And so by 1818, we pass our first state constitution, we disestablish Congregationalism, but the biggest problem in this Constitution is that it says, Article 6, Section 2, of the qualification of electors, meaning, who has the right to vote in this state? The free black population has been growing significantly, and it gets to a point in 1818 where the powers that be decide, we don't want them voting. Okay? And so you get this. Section 1, All persons who have been or shall hereafter, previous to the ratification of this Constitution, be admitted freemen. According to the existing laws of this state, they shall be electors. So if you're born in Connecticut, you're an elector in that town, you can cast your vote in that given town, except Section 2, every white male citizen of the United States who shall have gained a settlement in this state, attained the age of 21 years, and resided in the town in which he may offer himself to be admitted to the privilege of an elector at least 6 months preceding, and have a freehold estate of the yearly value of $7 in the state, so you had to have some taxable property, or having been enrolled in the militia, shall have performed military duty. It's that first section where it says every white male citizen. In one fell swoop, one section of the Constitution, the state of Connecticut, the General Assembly, has just taken the right of the vote away from all free blacks in the state. And what's that? At any age. At any, what's that? Oh, the Indians never had a right to vote. Right? Yeah. So, I mean, but the thing is that the African Americans who were in the state, many had done quite well for themselves, had started businesses, right? Were paying taxes. Some of them even write and petition the state and say, we're taxpayers. How can you take the right away of the voting away? So part of the abolition movement that pushes in Connecticut early on is to change this law. And the issue of the 1818 Constitution comes up over and over and over again. And it's such an excellent example of what's going on in the state of Connecticut in relation to race. So over the next several decades, prominent African Americans such as the Reverend Amos Beeman challenged the voting ban and attempted to change the state constitution. In 1846, they are successful, abolitionists are successful in forcing an actual referendum in the state. And what that means is they actually get it through both houses of the General Assembly in Connecticut and get them to say, yeah, so anytime you want an amendment to the Constitution, the same is true today. If you want an amendment to the Constitution of Connecticut, the General Assembly can pass that amendment, but it then must go to all of the people of the state in referendum where we get to vote in our regular appointed time of year, and we can vote it up or we can vote it down. This is what happens in 1846. Statewide referendum defeated by a vote of 19,148 to 5,353. Right? That's a pretty big margin. All right? The people of Connecticut do not want African Americans to have the right to vote. Right? In 1855, they call for a referendum. It's passed by the Senate, but it fails in the House of Representatives in Connecticut. Now again, what we have to be thinking about here is the timing of this and why this matters. Right? 1846, 2 years before Connecticut finally passes a law saying, yeah, we're getting rid of slavery completely. By the 1840s, so 1845, 1846 is the height of the controversy in the country over the annexation of Texas and adding Texas to the United States, which the threat of Texas means, I give one talk that's called, the American Civil War, Texas, 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 okay? Because Texas is one of the huge, in the 1840s, national battles and debates over the question of whether slavery will allow to be able to continue to expand in this country. And that is ultimately the thing that causes the Civil War. Lincoln, they charge him with being an abolitionist, but what the Lincoln's Republican Party is devoted to is not so much abolition and the complete getting rid of slavery, it's about stopping the extension of slavery into the West. So the early Republican Party was more anti-Southern in a lot of ways than they were anti-slavery. Right? And there are important distinctions there. Right? So in 1846, and you get to 1850, things are really heated up, and the abolition movement is very, very robust. But in the 1830s, 1840s, when you're talking about abolitionists, you're talking about 10% of the population. Most, as William Lloyd Garrison says, we meddlesome and pestiferous abolitionists. Abolitionists were called a lot worse than that. They were viewed as fanatics. They were viewed as crazy. They were viewed as the ones who were truly threatening the Union. William Lloyd Garrison many times had rocks thrown at him, was run out of town. Frederick Douglass had these kinds of issues as well. Being an abolitionist, even in New England, you were quite literally taking your life into your hands at this time. The vast majority of people in the North are not abolitionists. That changes a bit by the time we're getting into the 1850s, and one of the things that helps with it is Harriet Beecher Stowe's novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin. But Stowe, what's so interesting about Stowe is she doesn't go toe-to-toe against the pro-slavery people. She doesn't come out as an abolitionist. Instead, she writes a fictional novel in the genre of sentimental fiction and romance, and she writes in a sideways way about the breakup of the slave family and how bad it is for everyone involved. And so she comes at the issue of slavery in almost a sideways sort of way, and her novel gains tremendous popularity. 52,000 copies sold in the first few months of its publication. And by the way, I would kill for those publication numbers today. So it's translated into multiple different languages. By the end of a year, she sells 300,000 copies. I mean, it's amazing. So that's what's going on when all of this is going on. So Amos Beeman, this very well-known New Haven abolitionist, gets together with a number of other abolitionists, both white and black, and he writes this letter in 1847, after the referendum. And he says, "To the good people of the state of Connecticut, the undersigned were appointed a committee at the 11th annual meeting of the Connecticut State Temperance and Moral Reform Society of Colored Americans, held in New Milford, September 1st, and 1847, to address the freemen of the state of Connecticut in regard to granting the colored people of the state the elective franchise." So he puts this out in the Hartford Courant. Right? It is asked why we wish for the right of the elective franchise when we have made such improvements without it. We answer, we have made this improvement not because of this deprivation of our civil rights, but in spite of it, under the discouraging influences which always attend such a deprivation. And we have therefore shown ourselves worthy of the rights we ask at your hands. Political disenfranchisement tends to political, social, and moral degradation, just as truly as the possession and exercise of political rights tend to elevate the political and social and moral cultivation of a people. We are your fellow citizens, native born, and with you we must live and die. You have an inherent then whether you have an interest then, whether you feel it or not, in our welfare, in our being intelligent, virtuous, and good citizens. Incredibly articulate, right? Well written, and yet the referendum fails. They then complain, but wait a minute, we pay taxes. The state of Connecticut passes a law alleviating their requirement to pay taxes. When's the last time the state of Connecticut gave you your money back? Right? It just doesn't happen. So rather than change the state constitution and give the elective franchise to African Americans, they go, oh, you have to pay taxes? We're just okay, no problem. So, other acts of anti-black racism in Connecticut from this time period. A Negro college at New Haven, 1831. Therefore resolved by the mayor, aldermen, common council, and freemen of the city of New Haven in city meeting assembled that we will resist the establishment of the proposed college in this place by every lawful means. Okay? This is Simeon Jocelyn. He was the force from New Haven. This is actually a statue of him in New Haven. He was the founding pastor of the African American congregation that became Dixwell Avenue Congregational Church. So he attempts to create a Negro college in New Haven for the elevation of his people. And the town goes, no way we're ever letting this happen. Okay? This is not the first such example of this. And this comes out, resolved that the propagation of sentiments favorable to the immediate emancipation of slaves. Let me back up, I apologize. One of the things they also proposed, in addition to creating the Negro College, they also called for the immediate emancipation of all slaves in the United States. Right? So the town had something to say about that as well. And they say, resolved, that the propagation of sentiments favorable to the immediate emancipation of slaves in disregard of the civil institutions of the states in which they belong, and as auxiliary thereto, the contemporaneous founding of colleges for educating colored people is unwarrantable and dangerous interference with the internal concerns of other states and ought to be disregarded. Right? When you read documents from this time period, I teach a political history course. I have my students read every single inaugural address from George Washington to Rutherford B. Hayes. It's fascinating. When you get to the 1830s and 1840s, you start to see in the inaugural addresses the president addressing the institution of slavery, but they never call it slavery. They always refer it to the domestic concerns of the states, right? And so it's code language, which the domestic issues of the states are their domestic issues. States' rights, we won't bother people with that. So this idea of civil institutions of the states, well, the civil institution they're talking about is slavery. Don't tell other states to emancipate their slaves. Please.
Do you happen to know what year Yale started?
What year Yale started? Oh, I mean, Yale starts in the 1600s.
Wow.
Right?
Okay, so I just want to point that out to inform people what a head start orchestrated head start.
Yeah. Well, I actually just spoke to a friend of mine, Daisha Brabham, who just started working at the Gilder Lehrman Center at Yale, and she just literally sent me a link today that Yale is working on a project that's called Yale and Slavery, that is engaging the entire history, because there's been a lot of controversy over Yale. They changed the name of one of their schools because it was named after John Calhoun, who was a very, very well-known South Carolinian who was a big proponent of a pro-slavery advocate in the United States. So they're doing that work. Okay? So the New Haven Palladium has something to say about this too. This is the local New Haven newspaper. They say, "We mean without any jesting to say that there has been an attempt, a serious attempt, to get up an institution in this place for the education of colored men, which if carried into execution would ruin the prosperity of this city." They commented further that in connection with this establishment of a college, the immediate abolition of slavery in the United States is not only recommended and encouraged, but demanded as a right. So this is the attitude of a lot of the newspapers and a lot of the people from this time period. But this isn't Connecticut's biggest story. Most people, even if they know any of this history, they wouldn't know about the New Haven College. What they really know is about this. 1833, does that date ring a bell? That's the date that William Lloyd Garrison mentioned, right? It's 1833, and don't have the fear of Canterbury before your eyes. This is what he's talking about. This is Prudence Crandall, okay? So Prudence Crandall, she is hired by the people of the town of Canterbury to set up a finishing school for young women of the town. It's all white young women of the town, and she goes to the town and she sets it up. There is some question among historians as to whether or not William Lloyd Garrison put her up to this, right? That Prudence Crandall, we know that she was a subscriber to his newspaper, The Liberator, but we haven't found other letters or things indicating that she was working directly with abolitionists, but a lot of historians think that she was. And so what she ends up doing is there is a young African-American girl there named Sarah Harris. This is Sarah Harris to the right here, these statues are actually in the state capitol building in Hartford. These were done in a campaign in the 1990s that school children raised the money. It was called Pennies for Prudence. Prudence Crandall is today the state heroine. Nathan Hale is our state hero. Prudence Crandall is the state heroine. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But so Sarah Harris goes and sees what's going on in the school. She's working as a domestic in the school, and she goes up to Prudence Crandall and says, "May I take one of your classes?" And Prudence Crandall says, "Yes." And she starts teaching Sarah Harris. Well, what do the parents of all of the other children do? They pull their kids out of the school, right? So what does Prudence Crandall do? She starts advertising. Prudence Crandall, principal of the Canterbury, Connecticut female boarding school. And you can see one is an advertisement and one is a newspaper advertisement, right? It says, returns her most sincere thanks to those who have patronized her school and would give information on the first Monday of April next. Her school will be open for the reception of young ladies and little misses of color. The branches taught are as follows: reading, writing, arithmetic, English, grammar, geography, history, natural and moral philosophy, chemistry, astronomy, drawing and painting, music on the piano together with the French language. Right? And then you say, it says, the information respecting the school reference may be made to the following gentlemen. Arthur Tappan. Arthur and Louis Tappan are two of the wealthiest New Yorkers around and are hugely devoted to the abolition cause and give money to Garrison, give money to tons and tons of abolitionists. That's one of the indications that he's connected with Prudence Crandall. But this creates incredible controversy in the state. We could spend an entire hour or two just talking about this episode in Connecticut's history. Because what the townsfolk do is they don't decide, oh, well, all right, we'll just leave her alone. We pulled our kids. That is not what they do. This is what they do. Okay? They break all the windows in the school. They have riots outside. They pour manure into the well so that the drinking water is spoiled. And so Canterbury, this is in Willimantic, Windham County, excuse me. It has such a remarkable effect. Prudence Crandall is ultimately arrested. She is acquitted based on a technicality, but there is a Connecticut Supreme Court decision in which one of the justices, David Daggett, makes really remarkable statements about issues of race and citizenship in the state of Connecticut. And Daggett's comments in the brief that he writes are quoted by Roger Taney in the Dred Scott decision, if you know the Dred Scott decision. And Dred Scott is an 1856 Supreme Court decision that essentially says no black person, free or slave, can ever be a citizen in the United States. This is one of the reasons that the 14th Amendment is passed in the aftermath of the Civil War, to erase that precedent that's created by Dred Scott. Okay? So this is what happens. And it has an electrifying effect on Connecticut. And this, again, is really the beginnings of the abolition movement. And now do you understand why William Lloyd Garrison says what he says? Don't have the fear of Canterbury before your eyes. We've left this state alone too long. We've got to get involved here. So this is in the Norwich Courier. This is about the Prudence Crandall issue. It says, we might ask the citizens of any town in New England, wherever situated, would it be well for that town to admit the blacks from slave states or other states to an unlimited extent? Open once this door, and New England will become the Liberia of America. Okay? And Liberia is the Western African nation that is founded in 1816 to take free blacks and send them back to Liberia. It's the colonization movement. Okay? And so this is the attitude. If you allow free blacks from other parts of the country to come to Canterbury, what will become of our poor state? This one is particularly problematic. This is from, so the 1850s, We're moving towards the war years. We're moving towards the establishment of the Republican Party. If you remember, the Republican Party is really founded in the Midwest, in Illinois, Indiana, in about 1853. It's a new party. It comes out of the disintegration of the Whig Party and difficulties in the Second American Party system. The Democratic Party manages to survive nationally. The Whig Party does not. And out of the ashes of the Whig Party come two competing parties in the North. One is the Republican Party, which is opposed to the extension of slavery in the West. Right? They're not necessarily abolitionists, though there are abolitionists in the Republican Party. William Lloyd Garrison was completely opposed to all politics because he thought the entire system was corrupt. Okay? The other party was known as the Know Nothing Party. It was a nativist party. It was specifically opposed to immigration, and in particular to Catholic immigration to the United States. So the competition in the 1850s between the Know-Nothings and the Republican Party is fierce. In 1856, the Republicans nominate their very first presidential nominee, Jesse Fremont, and he loses that election. And Lincoln, among other Republicans, Lincoln is a moderate Republican, right in the middle. Lincoln recognizes if we don't attract know-nothing votes, we don't win in 1860. And Lincoln was a virtuoso when it came to politics. Right? I once heard, if you ever seen the movie Lincoln, right? Tony Kushner wrote the screenplay for that, and I went to a talk that he gave, and he described Lincoln as a 19th century political Mozart. That Mozart could see the notes in the air, and Lincoln could see the political maneuvering of what had to be done. Okay? It was just a very fascinating commentary on Lincoln. But this article in the Hartford Courant, written by the editor of the Hartford Courant, details where the Republican Party is in the 1850s. And it's a disturbing piece. And it says, it's titled Sam and Sambo. And it said, and of course, we know that what the term Sambo means. It's a derogatory term towards African Americans. Sam is the concept of Uncle Sam today, the true American Sam. It says, there are two ideas dominant at the present moment in the public mind. One is republicanism, the term arbitrarily used to express the necessity of making a stand in favor of freedom and the rights of the white man to labor on his own farm, uncontaminated by the insulting contiguity of black slaves laboring in the adjoining field at precisely the same work. This is the white man's party. This is the Republican Party of Lincoln. Okay? This is the white man's party. The issue, remember, they don't want the extension of slavery into the West. And so they're reacting to opponents who say, oh, you're a bunch of abolitionists. They write this to say, no, we're not abolitionists. We want free labor in the West, not black labor in the West. That's the point of this. It says, it is not because we feel any burning zeal in the black man's cause that we resist the progress of slavery in this country. We like the white man better than we do the black man. We believe the Caucasian variety of the human species superior to the Negro variety, and we would breed the best stock and fill this noble land of ours, this broad country, with white people. Again, this is 1856. This is remarkable for a Connecticut newspaper to be putting this out, and a Republican-led Connecticut newspaper. Again, it tells you something about where the state of Connecticut is on this issue. Okay? So we ultimately get to the Civil War. I could do a talk for you all about different battles and what's the most important battle and how does it change the course of the war. That's not what this talk is about tonight. This talk is about this other, much more troubling history, the aspect of the Civil War that we don't know enough about. Right? So even as the war begins and moves forward, most Northerners are not fighting on behalf of abolition. We've got umpteen number of letters from Northern soldiers going, I'm not fighting for abolition, I'm not fighting to end slavery, I'm fighting to save the Union. Lincoln said multiple times, we are the last best hope of earth, meaning that the idea of having a republican form of government, small r republican, not a monarchy, an elective franchise, right? Representative government, that if we can't make it work here, it won't work anywhere. This is the meaning, and this is why the majority of Northerners go and fight. Now, it's not saying that there aren't sentiments that change. You've got to understand that think about this region here, right? And how rural this was in 1861. You got a whole bunch of farm boys around here who go off to war and probably haven't been very far away from here. And they haven't actually had that much exposure, probably any exposure to the institution of slavery. Right? It's when some of them go down south and see it for themselves that they start to become more diehard in their views of issues of slavery and what's right and what's wrong. So it's not that the war doesn't have an impact. It most definitely does. But I think we've made a hugely outsized estimation in contemporary history that it was the moral North fighting the immoral South. It's just not that simple. Okay? So January 1, you get the Emancipation Proclamation. President Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation, which freed slaves in the Deep South and authorized the enlistment of black soldiers. For most Northerners fighting for the Union, it is an opportunity to hurt the South and end the war sooner. I had said to you that there's a difference between abolition and emancipation. Abolition is about black social and political rights. It's about human rights, it's about equality. Emancipation is about ending the institution of slavery. It doesn't promise any particular rights. Follow what I mean? If you are a soldier off to war in Virginia, or you have a brother or a father or a son or a husband who's off to war, and the president says to you, I can end this war sooner with Emancipation Proclamation. What are you going to say to that? Yeah, I want to go. Nobody expects this war to go on as long as it does, and nobody expects the bloodletting that occurs with it. And so when they get the opportunity to say, well, I'm going to stick it to the South, that's great. Right? I'll hurt the South. I'll end the war early. Doesn't hurt me, right? So they embrace emancipation, not necessarily abolition. Right? What do some of the Democratic newspapers in Connecticut have to say about the Emancipation Proclamation and about black soldiers serving? Right? The New Haven Register, Men of America, behold the picture of abolition barbarism. The program of abolitionism is, all things considered, the most monstrous and bloody project ever invented by the brain of man or fiend. Right? Listen, you can't put their hyperbole past them, right? They're imaginative. It's ridiculous, right? Hartford Times. Emancipation is a John Brown raid on a giant scale. The noble old flag, so dear to the heart of every true American, the starry banner that was once the symbol of power and the enforcer of respect among all foreign nations, is indeed sadly lowered and foully prostituted when it waves over a broken, weakened, and warring country and is cheered by the disciples of Garrison. Right? This is what Connecticut has to say. Now, understand, I could show you a bunch of articles from the Hartford Courant. They've turned the corner on this, and they are in support of emancipation. They're in support of Lincoln. So I am showing you a little bit of a side of this, okay? So what about President Lincoln? What do we think of him? This individual is never fit to be the President of the United States. He is too weak in intellect for the position, and by far too obscene to dignify one of the proudest and most elevated official stations in the world. He has some low cunning, some ward or district political management, but he has no mind capable of grasping great and complicated questions. If you poll Americans today, and this was done during the Commemoration, about 93, 94% of Americans have a very, very positive view of Abraham Lincoln. This is contemporary America. Right? That was not the way it was in 1863, and certainly not in Connecticut. Lincoln barely wins the presidential election of 1864 in Connecticut. Right? The other side, the other one, Hartford Times. I shall never vote again for Abraham Lincoln, said a somewhat influential Republican in this city on Monday. Heretofore, when you Democrats have charged that he was more for abolition than the Union, I denied it. Now I can't say one word. I am for no man who insists upon abolition as a condition, even to the opening of negotiations or the hearing of propositions. For one, I am ready to have the old Union again, without conditions, without slavery in the South, or not, just as the South themselves choose to decide it, for it concerns them most. Whatever else I do, you may be sure I will never vote for Abraham Lincoln again. Right? The Union as it was is a cry among Democrats throughout the entirety of the war, because the Union as it was is a union with slavery. September 1864. This is the Connecticut. Lincoln wins Connecticut by a mere 2,388 votes. That's it. The Democrats contend for a restoration of the Union, the Republicans for the emancipation of the Negroes. It is for the people to decide by their ballots on the 8th of November which they prefer, union and peace in the salvation of the country, or perpetual war in a vain effort to emancipate Southern Negroes. How many of you are aware of this history? Again, we don't know this history. Right? And there's specific reasons for that, which I've been trying to get across. But it doesn't necessarily get better. Lincoln wins. The war ends. 1865, the spring of 1865, Republicans in Connecticut are firmly in control of the General Assembly. Isn't it a perfect time to amend the Connecticut Constitution of 1818? Right? Emancipation has been, Lincoln puts through emancipation. The war ends. Just before the war ends, the 13th Amendment to the Constitution is put through, outlawing slavery in the United States. Now is a perfect time to change the Constitution of the state of Connecticut. So they pass an amendment to the 1818 Constitution, removing the word white in describing who may vote. Such a change would allow black suffrage, but it must go to referendum during the October elections. It's defeated by more than 6,000 votes in the state of Connecticut. And not only that, it's defeated by Republican votes. And how do I know that? Because in all the places in the various towns where it gets voted down, Republican candidates are overwhelmingly voted into office, yet the referendum is voted down. Okay? Which tells us in Connecticut that even in 1865, after Lincoln has been killed, and let's be very, very clear about why Lincoln is killed. John Wilkes Booth hears Lincoln deliver his very last speech, which is from a window at the White House. People are out celebrating the end of the war, and they are calling for Lincoln, and he comes to the window and he delivers a speech in which he suggests the idea that perhaps some blacks, in particular soldiers, should get the right to vote. And John Wilkes Booth makes the comment, he's in the crowd that night, and he literally says, we know it because he writes it in his own diary. He says, that means end citizenship. That's the last speech he'll ever make. Right? So Lincoln is assassinated specifically because he has turned the corner on this issue of his own ideas of emancipation versus abolition, and recognizes that the African Americans who have come and served the nation, he's met Frederick Douglass at least twice, maybe 3 times at this point, and he's come to have a greater understanding of what this war means. He's in a very different place in 1865 than he was in 1861 when the war begins. And he expresses that. That's the thing for which he is killed. And yet Connecticut, they defeat this vote by 6,000. And there are different places that have something to say about this. And this is before the vote is taken. Everybody is watching it, because what happens during Reconstruction in the South? People are watching New England and going, we know this vote is coming. What will a New England state do about this? And so here you have the question of Negro suffrage,
A popular vote is to be taken in Connecticut on the first Monday in October on an amendment to the Constitution by which the word white is to be stricken out from the clause prescribing the qualifications of electors. The amendment was passed almost unanimously by the last legislature for submission to the people. Its object is to place all black men on equal footing. The result of this vote will be awaited with considerable interest. Now that slavery has been abolished, it is certainly just and right that all the prejudice and the hostilities of race which it engendered should give place to sentiments of justice and equal rights. Whether they have done so or not, to any considerable extent in Connecticut, will be determined by this vote. So the New York Times recognizes what this vote means. Okay? Here's the Hartford Times after the vote. The vote is defeated by 6,000. Connecticut, the result, a white man's state in New England. Negro suffrage is defeated. Whether the majority against it proves to be 2,000 or 5,000 is a matter of secondary importance. The great fact stands out that Connecticut, a New England state, puts her seal of condemnation upon this mischievous scheme. And this has been done essentially by the conservative Republicans, in spite of unusually severe efforts of the Republican Party managers to whip them into a strict partisan vote. What does William Lloyd Garrison? We began with Garrison, we'll end with Garrison. What does Garrison have to say? Oh, this is the Liberator, right? So this is it. Great news from Connecticut. New England suffrage repudiated. Negro suffrage, the official vote. Now is this not a beautiful commentary on the abolitionism of New England? They are willing to break the Union in fragments in order to free the poor dear Negro, and yet they will not allow him to, even within their own borders, the rights of citizens. And then we get Garrison's main article about this. An evil decision. Connecticut's decision against the extension of suffrage to persons of color, though it does not much surprise us, is annoying. It helps strengthen the cause of bigotry and intolerance everywhere, and it will be especially serviceable to those politicians whose principal object is to prevent Southern freedmen from becoming citizens. To such men, this exhibition of meanness on the part of a New England state will be of priceless value. It is so quotable in support of slavery, prejudice, and injustice, which form the sum of their political creed, and their combination are known as democracy. Democracy in this context with the big D refers specifically to the Democratic Party. So this is where Garrison ends up. He publishes the Liberator for 30 plus years to see the 13th Amendment passed, to get rid of slavery, and then he has the neighboring state do this. And isn't it remarkable that we aren't as aware of this history as we certainly should be? And it tells us something, not just, as these most recent articles that I showed, it's not just about Connecticut and New England. It's about what happens in the rest of the country, and it's about what the precedent or lack of precedent, however you want to look at it, what it says about Reconstruction and the way that America goes. Right? So again, we could ask the question, if you want to talk about other aspects of African American history in the United States and what W.B. Du Bois says and how he argues on behalf of abolitionism. You can go all the way to Martin Luther King Jr. You can go all the way to the BLM movement. It is a struggle that has been going on for an awful long time. I think in some ways Connecticut has changed quite a bit, not in enough ways. You live in a city, or in a county rather, that has a city that has an incredible problem with poverty and urban life in one of the most wealthy counties in the nation, right? So this history goes on. So, what can I answer for you? I know it's a heavy talk. I recognize that. Okay? Please.